Everything you picture about medieval tavern food is wrong. Forget royal feasts. Most people survived on perpetual pottage, rock-hard barley bread, and weak ale that was safer than water. Taverns were smoky, crowded lifelines where fire, food, and community kept villagers alive in a world where water could kill. The centerpiece of every tavern meal was pottage, a thick stew made from whatever grew within walking distance. The base was always grain, usually barley, oats, or rye, boiled down into a porridge-like consistency. The grain swelled as it absorbed liquid, creating a thick, sticky base that could hold whatever else went into the pot. This wasn't like modern soup that you sip from a spoon. This was substantial, almost solid, more like a wet risotto or a very thick oatmeal. Then came the vegetables. Onions and leeks formed the aromatic foundation. The tavern keeper would chop them roughly, not bothering with fine dice because it all broke down eventually, and throw them into the bubbling grain mixture. The onions sweetened as they cooked, breaking down into soft strands that disappeared into the pottage. The leeks added a milder onion flavor and bulk. These were the constants, available year-round, either fresh from storage or dried from the previous season. Cabbage, turnips, beans, peas, and carrots went in when they were in season. Spring meant fresh peas, tender and sweet. Summer brought beans and carrots. Fall delivered cabbage and turnips. Winter meant using dried beans and peas that had been stored in sacks, or root vegetables kept in cold cellars packed in straw. The seasonal variation was the only variety most medieval people experienced in their diet. You couldn't get tomatoes because they didn't exist in Europe yet. No potatoes, no corn, no peppers. The vegetable options were limited to what grew locally in the European climate. The whole mixture bubbled in a cauldron suspended over the fire for hours, sometimes days, creating a dish that one modern recreator described as so good and so cheap, after adding bits of bacon and melting cheese on top. The cooking time broke down the vegetables into soft, almost mushy consistency. The grain absorbed the vegetable flavors. The liquid reduced and thickened. What you ended up with was a bowl of hot, filling calories that cost almost nothing to produce and could feed dozens of people from a single cauldron. But medieval pottage rarely had bacon or cheese. Most days, it was just grain and vegetables, flavored with whatever herbs the tavern keeper could forage. Parsley, thyme, rosemary, maybe some garlic. The texture fell somewhere between modern soup and modern porridge, thick enough to stick to your ribs and provide the calories needed for 12 hours of manual labor in the fields. One historical account notes that pottage could become so thick after multiple reheating that it solidified into a hard cake, which peasants would eat days later. Every bowl came with bread, but forget about the fluffy white loaves you see at modern medieval fairs. Medieval bread for common folk was dense, dark, and made from whatever grain was cheapest. Barley bread had the consistency of modern rye, but heavier. It was coarse, grainy, and designed not to taste good, but to provide lasting energy. The texture was almost gritty from the coarsely ground grain. Biting into it required real jaw strength. Chewing it took time and effort, but it filled your stomach and kept you working through long days of manual labor. The baking process created bread that could last for days without spoiling, which was essential in a time before refrigeration. The crust was thick and hard, protecting the interior from moisture and mold. A fresh loaf was manageable with strong teeth. A 3-day-old loaf required dunking in ale or pottage to soften it enough to chew. A week-old loaf could genuinely be used as a weapon or building material. White bread existed, but it was made from wheat flour that had been sifted multiple times to remove all the bran and make it fine and light. This process was expensive and time-consuming, so white bread was luxury food for the wealthy. Common people ate what's now called whole grain bread, except medieval whole grain was much coarser than modern versions. The grinding stones left tiny fragments of stone in the flour, which wore down teeth over time. Dentalware from bread was so common that archaeologists can identify medieval skeletons partly by their ground-down teeth. The bread served another purpose. It was your plate, called a trencher. A thick slice of stale bread caught the drippings from your pottage or any meat, soaking up the juices until it became soft enough to eat. If you were too poor or too full, you'd leave the trencher behind for the tavern keeper, who'd give it to beggars waiting outside. This system meant nothing was wasted. The bread absorbed every drop of flavor, and even if the original eater didn't want it, someone else would. Starvation was common enough that soggy bread soaked in someone else's meal drippings was still valuable food. The drink situation reveals just how desperate medieval life was. Ale dominated because grapes didn't grow in northern Europe. Wine was imported from France, Spain, or Italy at costs that made it a luxury drink for merchants and nobility. In southern Europe, the situation flipped. Wine was the common drink, while ale was rare. But whether north or south, nobody drank water by choice. Medieval people understood, through bitter experience, that water killed, even if they didn't understand germ theory. One ex-post from a history enthusiast captures it perfectly. Ale was the lifeblood of the medieval community, flowing through its veins, hydrating its conversations, and occasionally blurring its memories into a warm, contented haze. The brewing process fell to women called alewives, who worked from their homes. They'd boil water with malted barley, adding herbs like heather, yarrow, or rosemary for flavor and preservation, before hops became standard in the 15th century. Malting converted the starches in barley into sugars that yeast could ferment. The actual brewing took place in large wooden vats. The alewife would boil water, add the malted barley, and let it steep for hours. Then she'd strain out the grain, leaving behind sweet liquid called wort. This wort got herbs added for flavor, then was left to cool before yeast was added. Fermentation took days. The mixture would bubble and foam as the yeast consumed the sugars and produced alcohol and carbon dioxide. The result was a murky, slightly sweet beverage that spoiled within days. Tavern keepers bought it fresh and served it fast. Quality varied wildly. Some ales tasted reasonable. Others tasted like someone boiled grass clippings with stale bread and called it a drink, but it kept you alive, which was the only standard that mattered. The speed of spoilage meant alewives were constantly brewing. When an alewife had fresh ale ready, she'd hang a sign outside her door, usually a pole called an ale stake, to advertise. Taverns provided more consistent supply because they had relationships with multiple alewives and could usually get fresh ale when needed. Now here's where medieval taverns get interesting. Occasionally, maybe once a month if the tavern served an area with reasonable traffic, actual meat appeared. Roasted meat was the medieval equivalent of ordering lobster at a modern restaurant. It signaled you had money or that something worth celebrating had happened. The most common meat was pork because pigs were efficient. They ate garbage, required minimal land, and converted scraps into protein faster than any other animal. Medieval pigs looked nothing like modern domesticated pigs. They were leaner, more aggressive, and closer to wild boars in temperament. Farmers would let them roam semi-wild in forests during fall to fatten up on acorns, then round them up for slaughter before winter. This system meant pork was most available in late fall and early winter. Slaughtering a pig was a community event because one pig produced more meat than a single family could eat before it spoiled. The animal would be killed, bled, butchered, and the meat distributed or preserved. Some went to the tavern as fresh pork for roasting. One pig could feed a tavern for a week if the keeper roasted it properly over an open fire, rotating it slowly to render the fat and crisp the skin. The roasting process took hours. The pig or a large joint of pork would be mounted on a spit that rested on brackets over the fire. Someone had the job of slowly turning it. The skill was maintaining a steady, slow rotation that cooked the meat evenly. The smell would fill the tavern and drift outside, advertising to the whole village that meat was available. Chicken came next in the hierarchy of meat availability. Chickens were common enough that even poor households might keep a few for eggs, and an older bird that stopped laying would end up on the tavern spit. But here's what no one tells you. Medieval chicken was nothing like modern chicken. These were lean, gamey birds that spent their lives scratching in dirt and eating insects. One modern person who tried historically accurate roast venison described it as dry as a bone, and medieval chicken would have been similar, tough and stringy unless cooked in a stew where hours of simmering broke down the muscle fibers. Rabbit and game birds appeared when hunters had a good day and needed quick money. The tavern keeper would buy the catch, roast it, and charge premium prices to anyone willing to pay. But the majority of tavern patrons never saw these meals. They came in, ordered pottage and bread, drank their ale, and left. The roasted meat was for traveling merchants, minor nobility passing through, or locals celebrating a wedding or festival. Fish created its own calendar in the Aoidozi medieval tavern. The Catholic Church mandated fasting days when eating meat was forbidden. Every Friday, religious feast days, and the entire 40 40 days of Lent. On these days, taverns pivoted to fish. If the tavern sat near a river or coast, the keeper might serve fresh bream, pike, or herring, roasted over the fire, or boiled in the pottage. Inland taverns relied on preserved fish, usually salted or dried, which required soaking in water overnight to remove enough salt to make it edible. The preservation process for fish was intense. Fresh fish would be cleaned, then either packed in salt or hung to dry in the air. Salt-preserved fish could last months, but became incredibly hard and required extensive soaking to rehydrate. Dried fish, sometimes called stockfish, became so hard it needed to be beaten with a hammer to break it into pieces before soaking. The soaking water would turn cloudy with salt and fish proteins, and that water had to be changed multiple times before the fish was soft enough to cook. Even after soaking, preserved fish retained a strong, salty flavor and a texture that was never quite right. It was chewy, sometimes stringy, and always fishy in a way that fresh fish never is. But on fasting days, it was your option. No meat meant fish or nothing. The tavern keeper would throw the rehydrated fish into the pottage or roast it over the fire, and customers would eat it because the alternative was going hungry or breaking church law, which carried serious social consequences. The quality ranged from decent to absolutely horrific, depending on how long the fish had been preserved and how honest the merchant selling it was. Fish merchants were notorious for selling old stock that was starting to spoil, especially to inland areas where people had less experience judging fish quality. A tavern keeper who got fooled would end up serving rancid fish to customers, leading to complaints, fights, and damaged reputation. Smart keepers built relationships with trustworthy fish merchants and paid premium prices for better quality, which they then passed on to customers through higher prices on fasting days. One historical menu reconstruction lists herring pie as a common fasting day option, a dish where salted herring was baked inside a pastry crust with onions and herbs. Modern recreators call it surprisingly good when done properly, but medieval versions probably varied wildly based on the freshness of the ingredients and the skill of the cook. Smoked fish was another option, brought in from coastal areas and sold in markets. It kept longer than fresh fish, but tasted, in the words of one modern enthusiast, like someone tried to preserve the ocean in wood smoke and failed halfway through. Cheese arrived at medieval taverns as a near-constant presence. It was portable, didn't require cooking, and provided protein and fat that made the grain-heavy diet more filling. Most cheese came from sheep or goat milk because cows were expensive to maintain and primarily used for labor. Sheep and goats were smaller, ate less, and could graze on poor or rocky land. The cheese-making process started with fresh milk heated until warm. The cheesemaker would add rennet, which caused the milk to separate into solid curds and liquid whey. The curds were collected, pressed to remove excess whey, and then salted heavily. Fresh cheese was eaten immediately, but most milk went into aged cheese. The pressed salted curds were formed into wheels and left to age in cool cellars for weeks or months. During aging, the cheese lost moisture, became harder, and developed strong flavors. The cheese was hard, aged, and sometimes studded with nuts or herbs. One historical account mentions old cheeses studded with roasted hazelnuts, suggesting that tavern keepers occasionally got creative. The texture and flavor fell somewhere between modern aged cheddar and Parmesan, sharp and crystalline from months of aging. Biting into it required strong teeth because the cheese was dense and hard, but paired with ale and dark bread, it provided concentrated calories and sustained energy. Fresh cheese was a seasonal luxury, appearing in late spring and summer when animals produced excess milk. Most of the year, you got the hard stuff that could crack your teeth if you bit it wrong. But paired with ale and dark bread, it was enough to keep a traveler going for another day on the road. Now let's talk about what happened when tavern keepers tried to impress people. Occasionally, a tavern in a wealthy area or one catering to merchants would offer upgraded dishes to justify higher prices. These weren't common, but they existed as proof that medieval cooks could create interesting food when money and ingredients were available. The key word is available. Most of these dishes required ingredients that were seasonal, regional, or expensive, limiting them to specific times and places. Apple cider braised chicken, appeared in regions where apple orchards were common, combining the local cider with a whole chicken stewed until the meat fell off the bone. The cooking process was slow and deliberate. The tavern keeper would take a chicken, usually an older bird that had stopped laying eggs, and place it in a pot with apple cider, onions, and whatever herbs were available. The pot went on the edge of the fire, where it would simmer gently for hours. The cider's acidity broke down the tough muscle fibers, tenderizing the meat while adding a subtle sweetness. The alcohol cooked off, leaving behind apple flavor that permeated the chicken. The result was tender, slightly sweet, and represented the pinnacle of what a medieval tavern could achieve when money was no object. The chicken would be so tender you could pull it apart with your fingers, no knife needed. The broth reduced and thickened, becoming a sauce rich with chicken fat and apple essence. Served with bread to soak up the sauce, this dish could command premium prices from traveling merchants or minor nobility passing through the area. Beef and oyster pie sounds bizarre to modern ears, but it was a real dish in coastal areas. The pie combined chunks of beef with oysters, which were cheap and abundant in medieval times, not the luxury item they became later. Oysters were so common that they were considered poor people's food, something you ate when you couldn't afford proper meat. But someone discovered that combining them with beef created something greater than either ingredient alone. The oysters added brine and umami to the beef, creating a rich filling inside a pastry crust. The beef provided substance and meatiness. The oysters provided moisture and a complex, savory flavor that made the filling taste richer than it was. The pastry crust held it all together and provided more bulk to make the expensive beef stretch further. Modern recreations suggest it's actually delicious, the salt from the oysters balancing the richness of the beef in a way that makes sense once you try it. But medieval people discovered this through experimentation, not because they had modern food science to guide them. Veal cutlets with mushroom sauce represented serious luxury. Veal meant slaughtering a young cow before it reached productive age, something most farmers couldn't afford. The mushrooms, foraged from forests, added earthiness and were cooked in what little cream or butter the tavern keeper could source. One modern comment about a similar beef and mushroom dish notes: "There is always someone who does this, and we're talking about a savory dish of beef cooked slowly in red wine, with mushroom and pearl onion garnish. But yes, it's gross." The complaint highlights how modern people often reject historical foods before trying them. Pickled cabbage relish served as a condiment, something to cut through the richness of roasted meat or add flavor to bland pottage. The pickling process involved boiling cabbage in a salt and vinegar mixture, sometimes for hours, until it softened and absorbed the brine. One historical source describes the process. Pickling might require boiling the foods in a salt mixture, but it could also be done by simply leaving the food items in an open pot, tub, or vat of salt brine with the desired flavorings for hours and sometimes days. The result was sour, salty, and probably closer to modern sauerkraut than anything refined. Salted beef and turnip pottage elevated the standard vegetable stew by adding preserved meat. The beef had been packed in salt for weeks or months to prevent spoilage, making it incredibly salty and tough. It required long cooking times to rehydrate and soften, and even then it remained chewy. But it added protein and fat to the turnips, creating a meal substantial enough to satisfy hard-working laborers. The turnips themselves were a common root vegetable, available in winter when other vegetables were scarce, and they absorbed the salty beef flavor during cooking. Let's pivot to the desserts, because even medieval taverns offered something sweet if you had coin. But understand that dessert as a separate course was rare. Most meals ended when the savory food ran out. Sweet foods appeared occasionally, usually as special treats during festivals or when specific ingredients were abundant and cheap. The concept of ending every meal with something sweet was a luxury mindset that most medieval people never experienced. Indian pudding sounds out of place, but the name is misleading. Made from cornmeal and molasses, it was a thick, sweet pudding, cooked slowly until it set into a custard-like consistency. The cornmeal provided texture, while the molasses added sweetness and a deep, almost burnt sugar flavor. The cooking process took hours. The mixture would be poured into a pot or clay vessel and set at the edge of the fire, where it received gentle, consistent heat. Too much heat, and it would scorch. Too little, and it wouldn't set properly. The tavern keeper had to watch it carefully, stirring occasionally to prevent sticking. The final product was dense and filling, closer to modern polenta or grits than a light pudding. The molasses gave it a dark color and an intensely sweet flavor that was almost overwhelming by modern standards. But in a diet that was otherwise nearly devoid of sugar, that intensity was welcome. It was cheap to make, since molasses was a byproduct of sugar production and cornmeal was affordable, but it represented a luxury compared to the savory pottage that dominated most meals. People saved their coins specifically to buy a bowl of sweet pudding as a rare treat. Molasses pudding appeared as a variation, sometimes including raisins, eggs, or suet to make it richer. Suet was hard fat from around the kidneys of cattle or sheep, and when mixed into pudding, it created a dense, filling dessert that stuck to your ribs. The fat melted during cooking, creating pockets of richness throughout the pudding. Raisins, imported from southern Europe or the Middle East, added concentrated sweetness and texture. Each raisin was a burst of intense sweetness that contrasted with the dense pudding around it. The inclusion of eggs, when available, transformed the pudding into something closer to custard. The eggs provided protein and helped the pudding set into a firmer texture. But eggs were valuable, needed for baking bread and making other dishes, so their inclusion in pudding marked it as a special occasion dessert rather than everyday fare. One modern comment about winter puddings notes, winter steamed puddings and pies, mostly apple and custard, suggesting these heavy desserts were seasonal, appearing when cold weather made warm, filling foods more appealing. The timing of desserts mattered. Winter desserts provided concentrated calories when food was scarce and bodies needed extra energy to stay warm. Summer desserts used fresh fruit that would otherwise spoil. Spring and fall desserts took advantage of whatever ingredients were currently abundant. This seasonal rhythm meant you couldn't get your favorite dessert year-round. You got what was available when it was available, and you appreciated it because you knew it wouldn't last. Apple fritters with cinnamon showed up in taverns during harvest season when apples were abundant and cheap. The cook would slice apples, dip them in a simple batter made from flour and eggs, and fry them in whatever fat was available, usually lard or beef tallow. Cinnamon was expensive, imported from Asia, but even a small amount sprinkled on top elevated the dish from peasant food to something worth remembering. The result was crispy on the outside, soft and sweet on the inside, and one of the few medieval desserts that still tastes good by modern standards. Gingerbread loaf was another spiced luxury, made with honey, flour, and imported ginger. The expense of ginger limited this to wealthy areas or special occasions, but when it appeared, it signaled that the tavern keeper was catering to a higher class of customer. The loaf was dense, sweetened with honey rather than sugar, since sugar was even more expensive, and the ginger provided a warming spice that medieval people associated with medicine as much as flavor. Now we need to address the drinking habits beyond ale. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was less common than ale, but appeared for special occasions. Its production depended on honey availability, which was limited since honey was precious. Medieval people used honey for sweetening, medicine, and preservation, so dedicating enough to make mead meant sacrificing other uses. When it appeared at taverns, mead was sweet, strong, and expensive. One historical enthusiast notes, mead, the ancient drink of fermented honey and water, also made an appearance, though it was perhaps less common than ale. Cider provided an alternative in apple-growing regions. Made by fermenting apple juice, it had a similar alcohol content to ale, but tasted completely different, tart and fruity rather than grainy and herbal. One Reddit user notes, and apple cider was a good replacement of ale if you couldn't buy some. In areas where apples grew abundantly, cider could be cheaper than ale and just as effective at preventing waterborne diseases. Let's address one of the biggest misconceptions. Medieval people didn't eat elaborate spiced dishes except during festivals or in wealthy households. The image of heavily spiced medieval food comes from noble feasts, not daily life. Common people had access to basic herbs, parsley, thyme, rosemary, garlic, chives, and maybe some marjoram. These grew locally and could be foraged or cultivated in small gardens. Every peasant household might have a small plot where they grew a few herbs for cooking and medicine. These herbs were free, except for the labor of tending them, but imported spices like black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger were luxury items costing as much as a day's wages for a single ounce. These spices traveled thousands of miles from Asia, passing through multiple merchants, each taking their profit. By the time cinnamon reached a European market, it might have changed hands hands a dozen times, each transaction adding cost. The final price was astronomical by medieval standards. A pinch of cinnamon in your dessert represented serious wealth. The spice trade was one of the most profitable businesses in medieval Europe. Merchants could retire wealthy on a single successful spice voyage. The demand was insatiable among the wealthy, who used spices not just for flavor, but as status symbols. Serving heavily spiced food announced to your guests that you had money to burn. The spices themselves often mattered less than the display of wealth they represented. Some nobles would sprinkle expensive spices on mediocre food just to show they could afford to waste them. The tavern pottage might have rosemary and thyme because those grew wild, but it wasn't getting nutmeg or black pepper unless a wealthy merchant decided to eat there and paid premium prices for a customized meal. And even then, the tavern keeper might not have access to those spices because local markets didn't stock them. Mustard occupies a middle ground. Mustard seeds grew in Europe, making mustard relatively affordable. The seeds were ground into powder and mixed with vinegar, wine, or water to create a paste. This paste provided sharp, pungent flavor that elevated simple foods. Boiled ham with mustard sauce was achievable for a decent tavern because mustard wasn't prohibitively expensive, but even mustard required some investment. You needed enough mustard seeds, vinegar, or wine, and someone with the knowledge to mix them in the right proportions. Get it wrong, and you'd create something too bitter or too weak. The class division in medieval food was stark and enforced by law in some regions. These weren't suggestions. They were legal restrictions backed by serious punishment. Sumptuary laws dictated not just what you could eat, but what you could wear, where you could live, and how you could conduct yourself. The entire social order depended on visible markers of class, and food was one of the most important markers. Peasants caught hunting deer in noble forests faced mutilation or death. The deer belonged to the nobility by law, and eating venison without permission was theft. From the ruling class, foresters patrolled noble lands specifically to catch poachers. The punishment was brutal and public, meant to deter others from trying. You might lose a hand for your first offense. Second offense could be hanging. The severity reflected how seriously the nobility took their exclusive food rights. Venison wasn't just meat. It was a symbol of power and status that commoners were forbidden from touching. Even dead deer that died naturally couldn't be claimed by peasants who found them. The carcass belonged to the lord, who owned the land. A peasant who took meat from a deer that died of disease or accident could be prosecuted just as severely as one who hunted it deliberately. This created situations where peasants would discover dead deer, know that the meat could feed their starving families, and have to walk away because the legal and social consequences of taking it were worse than continued hunger. This meant tavern meat was limited to domesticated animals, pigs, chickens, sheep, and cattle when available, plus whatever wild game peasants could legally hunt. Rabbits were fair game because they were considered pests that damaged crops. Birds that weren't specifically game birds could be caught with nets or traps. Fish from rivers and streams were usually available unless the lord claimed exclusive fishing right, which happened frequently in areas with good fishing. But large game, anything that required real hunting skill and provided substantial meat, was off-limits to common people. The absurdity of this system becomes clear when you consider that a peasant family could starve while watching deer graze in fields nearby. The deer would eat the same crops the peasants tended, reducing the harvest, but killing one to prevent crop damage was illegal. The social order mattered more than practical food security. Maintaining the distinction between noble and common food was essential to maintaining the entire feudal hierarchy. If peasants could eat venison, what other noble privileges might they claim next? Let's talk about ale-soaked sausages, because they represent the intersection of preservation and flavor. Sausages were made by stuffing meat scraps, fat, and grain into animal intestines, then either drying them or smoking them for preservation. Ale-soaked versions involved simmering the sausages in ale before serving, which rehydrated dried sausages and added flavor. The alcoholic taste was prominent, and one modern person who tried reconstructed alcoholic historical foods note, "The alcoholic ones were the worst for me. It had such a disgusting aftertaste. But medieval people weren't eating for pleasure as much as nutrition, and ale-soaked sausages provided protein and calories. Boiled ham with mustard sauce elevated preserved pork to something more interesting. The ham had been salted and smoked, making it shelf-stable for months, and boiling it removed enough salt to make it edible while heating it through. Mustard sauce was made from ground mustard seeds, vinegar, and sometimes honey, creating a sharp, tangy condiment that cut through the richness of the ham. Mustard grew easily in medieval Europe, making it one of the few strong flavors available to common people. Buttered peas with mint sound simple, and they were. Peas were boiled until soft, then tossed with butter if it was available, and fresh mint from the garden. The result was a side dish that added color and nutrition to a plate otherwise dominated by brown and gray foods. One historical rhyme captures how important peas were. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. The rhyme isn't exaggerating. Pea pottage could be reheated day after day, with more water or ale added to thin it out, stretching a single pot across a week of meals. Chicken and dumplings appeared in better taverns as a hearty stew. The chicken was stewed with vegetables until tender. Then dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the bubbling broth to cook. The dumplings absorbed the chicken flavor while adding bulk to make the stew stretch further. It was comfort food in the truest sense, warm and filling, perfect for cold weather or tired travelers. Suet pudding with raisins combined that hard kidney fat with dried fruit and flour, steamed in a cloth until it set into a dense dessert. The suet made it incredibly rich, almost greasy, but in a world where most people struggled to get enough calories, that richness was valuable. The raisins added sweetness and texture, imported from southern Europe or the Middle East at considerable cost, marking this as a special occasion dish rather than everyday fare. Ale-battered haddock showed up in coastal taverns, especially in England. The fish was dipped in a batter made from flour and ale, then fried in hot fat until crispy. One modern comment about British food note: a full English breakfast, fish and chip, a properly made Wellington, a good Cornish pasty, excellent stuff. While fish and chips as we know it came later, the medieval ale-battered fish was its ancestor, using similar techniques to create crispy fried fish. Minced mutton pie involved chopping mutton into small pieces, mixing it with onions and herbs, and baking it inside a pastry crust. Mutton was meat from older sheep, tough and gamey, but cheap since the sheep had already provided years of wool. The long cooking time inside the pie broke down the tough meat, making it tender. One modern person trying traditional pie and mash note: "I thought it was disgusting, probably the most bland meal I've ever had." But this reflects modern preferences for strong flavors, rather than the medieval reality, where bland food was normal. Roast pigeon with bread stuffing used wild pigeons, which were abundant and free for anyone who could catch them. The birds were small, so multiple pigeons were needed for a meal, but they provided protein and fat. The bread stuffing absorbed the bird's juices during roasting, creating a savory filling that stretched the meat further. Pigeons were lean, almost gamey, but roasted over an open fire with herbs, they were acceptable eating. Apple tansy was a fried apple custard, made by mixing apples with eggs and cream, then frying the mixture until it set. The result was somewhere between an omelet and a pancake, sweet from the apples and rich from the eggs. It appeared during harvest season, when apples and eggs were both abundant, offering a warm dessert that used seasonal ingredients efficiently. Stewed calf's head represented the medieval commitment to using every part of an animal. The head was boiled for hours until the meat became tender and the bones released their gelatin, creating a rich, sticky broth. The meat was picked off and served with the broth, and while modern people might find it off-putting, medieval people saw it as valuable food that would otherwise go to waste. Offal dishes like this were common because throwing away edible parts of an animal was unthinkable when food scarcity was constant. Ale flip was a tavern drink made by mixing ale with rum and a raw egg, then heating the whole mixture with a hot poker until it frothed. The result was warm, rich, and alcoholic enough to provide serious warmth on cold nights. One historical note mentions lead cups were used to drink ale or whiskey. The combination would sometimes knock the imbibers out for a couple of days, which speaks to both the strength of historical drinks and the dangerous materials used to serve them. The tavern social dynamics deserve deeper attention because food and drink were secondary to the real purpose, gathering. In the tavern, ale loosened tongues and lowered the social barriers that normally kept people rigidly within their class positions. Disputes rose over everything: land boundaries that shifted when floods washed away markers, unpaid debts that festered for years, livestock that wandered into the wrong fields and damaged crops. These arguments could turn violent, punches thrown, benches used as weapons, blood on the floor. The tavern keeper had to balance allowing enough freedom to keep people coming back while preventing violence that would destroy the business or lead to legal trouble. But these same neighbors also celebrated together when harvests came in good, when children were born, when couples married. A wedding feast might be held at the tavern if the family could afford it, with the keeper providing extra food and ale on credit to be paid back over months or years. These celebrations created the bonds that held communities together. You couldn't stay angry at the man who'd danced at your daughter's wedding. You had to forgive the woman who'd helped you celebrate a good harvest, even if she still owed you money from a previous transaction. The tavern was where news traveled faster than anywhere else. Travelers brought stories of distant places, wars, plagues, political changes. Before newspapers or regular mail service, word of mouth was how information spread, and the tavern was where mouths met ears. A merchant passing through might mention that the king had raised taxes in another region, causing riot. That information would spread through the tavern within hours, then spread through the village within days. People made decisions about their own lives based on these second-hand reports, sometimes with disastrous results when the information proved false or exaggerated. Young people learned about the world beyond their village by listening to travelers' stories. Most peasants would never travel more than 10 or 20 miles from their birthplace in their entire lives. The tavern gave them glimpses of a larger world, cities with thousands of people, ships that crossed oceans, wars in foreign lands, strange foods and customs. Some of these stories were true. Many were exaggerated. Some were complete fabrications told by travelers who enjoyed embellishing for an appreciative audience. But all of them expanded the mental horizons of people whose physical horizons were severely limited. The keeper controlled this space with an iron fist wrapped in superficial friendliness. Troublemakers got thrown out physically, sometimes with help from other patrons who didn't want their gathering space disrupted. People who couldn't pay their tabs got barred from entry until they settled their debt, which could mean weeks or months of social isolation, since the tavern was the primary gathering place. Repeat offenders found themselves permanently banned, forced to travel to the next village's tavern if they wanted to drink ale and socialize, adding hours to their day. But for those who followed the rules and paid their way, the tavern offered warmth, food, drink, and human connection in a world that was brutally isolating. Medieval life meant living in villages of a few hundred people at most, working from dawn to dusk in fields or workshops, and having limited contact with anyone beyond walking distance. Your world consisted of people you'd known your entire life, doing the same work your parents and grandparents had done, with little hope of change or advancement. The tavern was the exception, the place where the boundaries relaxed slightly, and you could be something other than a farmer or craftsman for a few hours. You could be a storyteller sharing your experiences, a listener learning about the wider world, a friend celebrating someone else's good fortune, a mourner sharing grief over someone's death. The tavern accommodated all these roles in ways that the rigid social structures outside couldn't. The tavern experience was about survival, dressed up as community. The food kept you alive. The ale kept you hydrated. The fire kept you warm. The company kept you sane. Medieval people gathered in taverns because the alternative was isolation in dark, cold houses with no entertainment beyond sleep. The tavern offered light, warmth, and human contact, and the food and drink were the price of admission. Medieval scarcity made every good meal memorable. The tavern pork roast happened maybe once a month. You looked forward to it for weeks. You savored every bite. You talked about it afterward, comparing it to previous roasts, debating whether the keeper had done better or worse this time. The experience of eating something good was spread across time. The anticipation before, the consumption during, and the memory after. Each phase added to the overall experience in ways that our constant food abundance can never replicate. The medieval tavern wasn't a restaurant in the modern sense. It was a survival station that doubled as a social hub. The food was fuel measured in calories and nutrient, not taste and presentation. The drink was medicine that kept waterborne diseases from killing you. The atmosphere was the real product being sold, the chance to gather with neighbors, share stories, and remember that life wasn't just endless labor in muddy fields under gray skies. For a few hours, with ale in hand and firelight dancing on timber walls, medieval people could forget their hardships and just be human together, connected by shared experience and shared suffering. That's what food was served in a medieval tavern, not the elaborate feasts of fantasy novels with their sugar sculptures and exotic spices, not the romanticized medieval times restaurant experience with whole roasted chickens and unlimited drink, but simple, repetitive, survival food that kept Europe alive through centuries of hardship. Grain and vegetable pottage eaten from wooden bowls, dense, dark bread that could break teeth, weak ale consumed by the leader, and occasional meat when fortune smiled. This was the reality, and understanding this gap between fantasy and reality doesn't diminish the medieval period. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. These people built civilizations while eating the same bowl of grain and vegetable stew day after day. They created art that still moves us centuries later. They pushed human knowledge forward through innovation and experimentation. They loved, fought, laughed, and died, all while subsisting on a diet that modern people would consider intolerably boring after a single week. They didn't just survive this diet, they thrived despite it, creating the foundation for the modern world we inhabit. The medieval tavern meal was humble, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. It provided what people needed: calories to work, hydration to survive, and a gathering place to maintain sanity in a hard world. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival and community are their own kind of feast. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on the cards playing on your screen to watch similar content.